Let's bring in our panel now. Joining me from Washington, D.C. is David Sedney. He was a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and is now a Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Javid Faisal is in Kabul. He's a former Deputy Spokesman to the Chief Executive of Afghanistan. And Graeme Smith is in London. He's a former UN Political Affairs Officer in Afghanistan and now a consultant for the International Crisis Group. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Graeme Smith, let me begin with you. Is the Taliban the one with the upper hand? Are they negotiating from a position of power here?
Well, it's not just me saying that, to be honest with you. The U.S. military produces analysis of how much ground is held by the insurgency and how much ground is held by the government. And year by year, they show more and more ground held by the insurgency. Now, you can argue about the finer points of that, but just about everyone agrees that the battlefield momentum is with the Taliban right now. And that is reflected in what you're seeing in the negotiations in Doha. The Taliban are behaving in a fairly confident way, as they should, because they are in a pretty good place militarily.
David Sedney, while they negotiate in Doha, they continue attacks, such as the one we saw in Western Afghanistan that killed 13 Afghan soldiers. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that, as Graeme said, the Taliban feel that they have an advantage and they're pressing that advantage. There does not seem to be any indication that the Taliban will be stopping their military attacks in the near future. Ceasefire has been on the table. There was a 3-day ceasefire last year. It was very, very successful. In fact, it was very successful among Taliban soldiers. That scared the Taliban leadership. So now they are very reluctant to go to a ceasefire until they get something in the negotiations that will put them in a permanently strong position. It's a very difficult set of negotiations.
Javid Faisal, let's go to the Afghan on the panel. Do you trust them?
I think this is a good start. We welcome the peace talks, but it could be both a success and a failure. If we are to trust them, I think it's up to Taliban. The success of this peace talks belongs to the Taliban. They have to show willingness to talk to the Afghans. They have to show willingness to peace. If they continue to attack and kill us in big numbers, it doesn't mean that they have any willingness for peace. There is no willingness if they continue to have attacks. But if they are willing to cut its ties to terrorists, if they are willing to agree to a ceasefire, if they are willing to agree to sit with the Afghan government and the people, then we can trust them. But still, there is a long way to get to that point. For now, we don't see any willingness of Taliban for the peace process. And as a P8 at this stage, it's not seen as an Afghan peace, but a peace between Taliban and Americans and Pakistanis,
right?
Not Afghans, because the Afghan people and the Afghan government are not presented in those talks.
Right. Javid, would you go so far as to agree with your former boss, the Chief Executive Abdullah, who believes that the Taliban is actually just using these peace talks in Doha for propaganda purposes?
I think if we go to the past of such discussions or intentions, however, this opportunity is a unique opportunity, but we have had talks with Taliban in the past too. As Pakistan wasted time, Taliban have wasted time. They were not willing to join peace talks. And again, today, their intents are not peaceful. Those are even more volatile, and this we cannot trust them.
Okay, so Graeme Smith, when you hear this from Javid Faisal, and the Afghans clearly feel left out, right? So we're seeing Zalmay Khalilzad meeting with the Taliban leadership, but it really should be Ashraf Ghani meeting with the Taliban leadership for a true sustainable peace, right?
Well, for really sustainable peace, what we need is intra-Afghan dialogue, conversation between the people of Afghanistan about their shared future. And, you know, it's not just the people in the government who feel left out at the moment. If you look at the last parliamentary elections that happened in October, only about 2/5 of eligible voters participated. So you have millions of Afghans who feel shut out of the so-called democratic process in Afghanistan. And so there needs to be some way of creating a political framework that represents all of the people of Afghanistan. And that's going to be a very, very difficult process. It will probably take years. And, you know, we're hearing a lot of anxiety from Kabul right now for very good reason about how this is going to go, because if there is a political misstep here, if the diplomacy does not go well, there is a risk of a renewed multi-factional civil war. We could be plunged right back into the bloodbaths of the 1990s. So people have reason to be worried. But I have to say, this is also a chance to end the largest war in the world. More people are being killed right now in Afghanistan than in Syria and Yemen combined. So this has to end, and diplomacy has to be given a chance.
David Sedney, when those numbers came out from the president himself at Davos, when he said 45,000 members of his country's security forces were killed since he became leader since 2014. 45,000, that was from the president himself. What do you think the decision makers in the Pentagon and the White House and the State Department were thinking?
Well, they would have already known that figure. I don't think that particular announcement made any new information to them. But you have to realize that beyond the 45,000 figure cited by President Ghani, there are just as many and probably a lot more Taliban who have been killed, and also thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of Afghan civilians have been killed and wounded. So the actual casualty tolls are much higher than that. So yes, this is a horrible war, as Graeme said, and it has to be ended. But in the 1980s, there was also a horrible war in Afghanistan where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And there was a peace agreement, and a Soviet general walked out and the Soviet troops withdrew. That was followed by an even worse civil war with even more people killed. The movement of al-Qaeda into Afghanistan, the attacks on 9/11, and a lot of other things have happened since. So yes, peace is needed, but it must be a good peace, a just peace, a lasting peace. If all you do is just pull out U.S. troops and don't do anything else, then Afghanistan will, exactly as Graeme said, descend into a civil war that will probably infect many other countries in the region and influence people around the world.
But David, is it really about the U.S. wanting a lasting peace? If it can be absolutely ascertained that the Taliban won't be giving up their country to some sort of foreign force or group of foreign fighters, as they did with al-Qaeda, which used it as a launching pad for 9/11 attacks, if they don't do it to Daesh or anybody else, if the Taliban just stays local and the U.S. can come to an agreement with them and leave, it's about saving face for the United States, isn't it? It's about another Vietnam of trying to not admit defeat and just leave when you can.
Well, I think you have to look exactly at what Ambassador Khalilzad, the U.S. negotiator, has said. He said there are 4 parts to the talks: discussion of U.S. troop withdrawal, a commitment by the Taliban to ensure that they don't support the terrorists, a intra-Afghan dialogue, which has to include the government, and Ambassador Khalilzad has said that has to include the government, and a ceasefire. So there are 4 elements, and Ambassador Khalilzad has said nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So I don't think it's the bilateral thing that you were laying out. It's actually a multilateral thing. And unless all of those things happen, including most importantly, as our colleague from Afghanistan says, the Afghan people with the Afghan government have to sit down with the Taliban, because no just and lasting peace can happen without all Afghans involved and without any excluded.
Javid Faisal, do you believe that the United States is committed to fulfilling all 4 of those aspects as it talks to the Taliban and tries to come to some sort of solution?
Let me make it clear. We are not fighting a civil war in Afghanistan. This is not a civil war. We are fighting a war against international terrorism. It's alongside our international partners, be it the United States or the Europe or NATO. So when we are fighting a war against international terrorism and the goal that we had from the very beginning has not been achieved yet, it doesn't mean it's a success for the US. It's not a success for Taliban either, or for Pakistan. It could only be a success when we achieve that goal, either through peaceful means or through battlegrounds, because as a P8, we don't see that's happening. And even when we hear the words about the agreements of Afghan soil not being used by terrorists, and Taliban agreed to that with the Americans, I don't think it's making sense, because Taliban are being supported and funded by our neighbors, and those neighbors are not likely to agree to such terms because they still see their interests in support of the terrorism. So if the Americans want a very peaceful end to this situation in Afghanistan, I think we have to achieve the goals. And it's better those goals be achieved through peace. But if peace does not work, if Taliban do not have any peaceful intentions for peace in Afghanistan, then I think it's not a success, and we cannot be very hopeful or optimistic about its future. It could only be a success when there is an intra-Afghan dialogue, and when we achieve that goal, when we can be assured that Taliban and Pakistan and others can no longer be in support of terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and other violent groups in this region.
And Graeme Smith, one of the crinkles in the talks was that, of course, there's a demand that the Taliban stops all support of terrorism or conducting any terrorism. And they go, well, what do you mean by terrorism, right? Because for them, the presence of any foreign occupying troops means that those foreign occupying troops are fair game. They don't consider that terrorism. Are we ever going to find a solution to that?
Yeah, I think we will find a solution to that because as it stands today, the Taliban every day in eastern Afghanistan are fighting bloody battles against international jihadists. They're the local affiliate of the Islamic State Khorasan. And the Taliban don't like those guys, and they're battling them extremely hard and dying out there in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. And so that's something that the Taliban have in common with the United States and have in common with the Afghan government. And so I think there is actually a basis for some kind of agreement on counterterrorism. But you're right, we have to agree on what we're talking about when we're talking about terrorism. It's not going to be enough for the United States to just say, we decide those guys are terrorists, therefore you should kill them. There'll have to be some sort of language hammered out about making sure that Afghan soil is not used as a launching pad for attacks against other countries. But keep in mind that since 2001, Afghanistan has not been a launching pad for any attacks against any country, as far as I know. And so this is actually something where we can reach agreement with the Taliban.
Are you that optimistic, David Sedney?
Well, Graeme has accurately stated what's happening with Daesh, but the big problem with the Taliban from 2001 on, of course, has been Al-Qaeda. And the Taliban have apparently been resistant about saying they would not continue to support Al-Qaeda. And I have to be clear on one thing, as Javid said, this is not an issue where the Taliban will say that Afghan soil cannot be used against the United States, but the Taliban don't control most of Afghan soil. They control a larger and larger part, as Graeme said, but a lot of it they don't control and never will. So the most important part is, do the Taliban support Al-Qaeda and other groups? And I understand that in this most recent round, there was discussion about that. They may have come up with language, but I would say that if this agreement does not specifically say the Taliban will no longer support Al-Qaeda, and Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of Al-Qaeda, is in areas where the Taliban have influence from everything we hear. Without that, that agreement will end up not having support in the United States, including by people in the White House. So I think we need to look very carefully at not just the definition of terrorism, but the naming of Al-Qaeda is really important.
Right. Good point about Al-Qaeda. Javid Faisal, if you had the power to decide tomorrow morning as to whether those 14,000 US troops stayed or left, what would you do?
You know, we don't want foreign troops to be in Afghanistan forever, but we do need them until we achieve that goal we have set at the very beginning 18 years ago. And that goal is still not achieved. I don't think it's acceptable to anyone here in Afghanistan or should be in the world that Taliban say we will not be supporting Al-Qaeda, because they were saying 18 years ago, we are fighting Americans because of Al-Qaeda. And today they are saying we are fighting Al-Qaeda because of Americans. I don't think it's very likely to happen. And in the same time, if that's even to happen, Taliban are still not a force that could be trusted. So we would definitely need international presence in Afghanistan until we achieve that goal that we had, and until we are assured that things are not going back to the very beginning. In the same time, I think it's if we go to the original discussion, it's not in accordance to the founding principles of the United States to talk to terrorists, and Taliban are terrorists. And when they were to sign a BSA, bilateral security agreement with Afghan government, how can Americans today talk to Taliban about BSA or the withdrawal of foreign forces, or not giving space to the insurgents or Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? We have a state in here, we have a nation is here. Taliban do not represent a state, Taliban do not represent a country or a nation or a government. They are a terrorist group. So any kind of talks about the future of Afghanistan, whether it's about its soil not being used against others, or whether it's about the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan, it should be discussed with Afghans. In what capacity are Taliban giving this assurance to the Americans. And in what capacity are the Americans accepting this assurance from the Taliban? I think these are very fragile discussions, and there has to be more concrete steps taken to make sure that the two other elements of the peace talks, a ceasefire and an intra-Afghan dialogue, it does happen. And then the assurances are being given by the Afghan people and the government, not by a terrorist group who was never trustworthy and who could never be trustworthy in the future.
Okay, Javid, Graeme, and David, it's been good talking to all of you. The reality that this war has gone on for so long that there are many US soldiers preparing for their first deployments of Afghanistan who were not born during 9/11. And the battle continues, the war endures, peace is elusive for now. David Sedney, Graeme Smith, Javid Faisal, thanks for joining us again on the Newsmakers.